everyone, my name is Ella and I'm the Plants Meow and welcome to my channel. So today I'm going to be talking about rooting your variegated monstera, and specifically the method I'm going to be using today is water propagation. There are plenty of methods to actually propagate your monsteras, but this is actually my preferred method. I'm not a person that has much luck with moss, and I don't particularly like rooting plants straight into soil, so water is really the best way for me. And today specifically I'm going to be talking about not just water propagation, but the fastest way to root your monstera when it's in water. There are always things that we could do that make that little bit of difference to speed up how fast your plant should root. And yes, today I am wearing glasses. This is actually the natural way I usually am. The majority of times I do wear contacts for my videos, and that's purely because I don't know, I feel weird when I wear my glasses and I record, but today I had physical therapy, I have a bit of a headache, and I'm just in no mood to wear my contacts, so here we are. So when propagating your variegated monstera, I recommend taking a top cutting, and usually with one with more than 2 leaves. The larger your cutting, the more energy your plant will have, and the more room you will actually have to work with if something actually goes wrong. So I know a lot of people are going to want to take mid cuttings, and honestly, I wouldn't recommend it because your plants are going to be really stressed if you take a mid cutting. I mean, it's possible to do it and be successful, sure, but what I really recommend is a really large top cutting, even one with 4 leaves. And actually, once it's done rooting in water, you can then cut it up and pot all the pieces. That way it's rooting as one whole healthy plant that's less stressed than a bunch of chopped up little plants. And I found this method to be the most successful. Whenever I've cut up my plants into a bunch of pieces, I've always had way more rot and way more risk of failure and way more stress on my plants than when I would have just left it as big chunks like I'm doing right now in this video. Now, a lot of people like to remove the aerial roots for aesthetic reasons, or sometimes they don't think they need them for propagation, but I recommend to not remove your aerial root. A trim may be necessary, like if you're someone like me that lets their aerial roots grow wild and they grow many feet long. But other than a trim, I don't suggest removing them because these are going to be the fastest way to rooting your monstera. And I usually recommend you trimming it back to no longer than 6 inches because a lot of the times as aerial roots grow longer, they get harder and it becomes really difficult for them to be more pliable. So if you get a really long aerial root that you put into water and only the end of it roots, and you actually go to pot it up and for some reason, for one reason or another, it actually snaps upon potting, then you've lost that bottom root system. So I recommend cutting it back shorter. That way it's less of a chance of it snapping if you try to mold it into a pot afterwards. So the next thing is going to be your container. I recommend a container that suits your particular cutting. For me, what works best is these oval shaped containers, so I can take a good top cutting and actually lay it flat on top of the oval. And what I like about it is it's not too wide and it's not too long, so the entire monstera does not fall into the water, and I can actually just direct the aerial roots down into the water. And this is something I do because I don't prefer to put the stems of the monsteras in water because a lot of the times variegated monsteras are actually really prone to root rot. And instead of risking that at all, I just don't put the stems into water. Sometimes this is unavoidable, but in the end, you're really just going to want to try to not put them fully into water. So after you found that perfect reservoir, the next thing you're going to want to do is to disinfect your reservoir to prevent any bacterial issues. Now, this is something that a lot of people don't think of before they're putting their monstera into something, but if you look at people that use hydroponics often, so they're using reservoirs that they really have to sterilize. And that's something you should be putting into practice when you're actually water propagating, especially when you're water propagating a monstera. A lot of my other plants, it doesn't really matter, even how clean my reservoir is, I can just shove them into water and they're completely fine. But when it comes to monsteras, you really want it to be as sterile as possible because of really how quickly they are so prone to rot. So you can sterilize your reservoir in multiple ways. You can either use a diluted bleach solution, hydrogen peroxide, or even Physin 20. So after your reservoir is properly sterilized, the next thing you're going to want to do is create your water solution. So again, while it is fine to just throw it in water, I have a particular water solution I use because for me it is the fastest way to get my monsteras to root rot-free. So the first thing for my water solution is I make sure I'm either using distilled or reverse osmosis water. Distilled or reverse osmosis is excellent. There is no microorganisms, no bacteria, nothing you have to worry about. Even things like spring water do have microorganisms in it and are going to be a risk for your plant. So in my research, I just found that these two water types are really the best kind that you can use. So the next thing you're going to do is make sure your pH is between a 5 and a 6. Now, I like this number because it's actually the perfect number for an aroid. You don't really want to put it on the high side because over time, your monsteras are going to absorb a lot of water, and any nutrients in the water are going to linger and actually raise the pH levels. So it's better that you start on the lower end. That way, if the pH level goes up, it's not going to go up too high. So the next thing I do is add a rooting hormone, and the one I particularly like is Rapid Start. So with Rapid Start, I usually use about 2 milliliters per gallon, and Rapid Start's amazing because it really focuses on those finer hairs that you're going to develop in your root system, and it just makes them root so much faster. I absolutely love the solution, and a good bottle goes a long way and it lasts you a long time. So the next thing I do is completely optional, but it's something I do just to be extra cautious, and that is using about 6 milliliters of clear res per gallon. Now I use clear res because it helps keep the water solution sterile, and sterile for our monstera is really the most important thing. The alternative to clear res, if you don't want to go out and buy it, is to use hydrogen peroxide, but be careful about the amounts of hydrogen peroxide you can use because too much hydrogen peroxide can actually kill your plant. But hydrogen peroxide is a great alternative because it really does break down bacterial issues that can occur. So something else optional you can use that you've probably seen a lot of people use are air stones. So the primary function of an air stone is to add more oxygen to your water. Honestly, I had never used air stones before until recently, and I did an experiment that I will be uploading a video of in a little bit where I have a few setups, one of them with an air stone, one without. I would say I didn't notice a difference with the plants in an air stone and the one without an air stone, but I can see the benefit of adding more oxygen to your water, which is to prevent rot, because obviously water with less oxygen is going to be a breeding ground for bacteria. So take with that what you will. It's kind of just a precautionary thing. They're actually relatively inexpensive. You can get them from your local hydroponic stores or just on Amazon, and I'll link some in my description below. But yeah, I don't think they're a necessary thing, but possibly helpful. So something else that I'm actually using that's new that I hadn't before, but I've actually found recently to actually be really great, are heat mats. So what I didn't really think about before with my water propagations, and if you're in no rush, then don't use a heat mat, but with heat mats, what they'll do is they'll increase your water temperature, and when that happens, you're actually going to get faster root growth. Because when your water gets below a certain temperature, it actually can slow down your growth, which is something I hadn't really thought about before. But again, I wasn't really in a rush before, so it didn't really matter to me as much. But if you really want your roots to grow faster, a heat mat is a definite plus, and it's an awesome bonus. The drawback is, as your temperature increases in your water, the oxygen will decrease, which unfortunately will greatly increase your chances of rot. Now, to counter this, you can make sure that your temperatures don't get too high, or you can even add something like an air stone. So I recommend if you actually are using a heat mat to use an air stone as well. You might as well go to that extra mile to make sure that you're perfectly oxygenated. So the temperature I like to keep mine at are between 72 and 76 degrees Fahrenheit. I caution getting to 80 degrees because while your roots will love it because the more heat the better, you're really setting yourself up from some possible issues with bacteria. But I really wouldn't have your temperature below 69 degrees Fahrenheit because that's when your roots really start to slow down. So something else that I do for my monsteras that I don't do for other plants is change out the water once a week. Typically when I'm propagating plants in water, I honestly just let them stay in the water they are and I just keep refilling it. Now, with how sterile it's important to keep your monsteras, I definitely recommend changing it. And every time I have changed it, I've definitely noticed it was necessary. The water just gets murkier, and it's something that you can't tell when it's sitting in the container, but when you're pouring it out, you can definitely tell all the buildup that's actually in your container and in your water. And the great thing about also changing out your reservoir is that you get to examine your plant. Do they have any rot? Do they have any plant matter that needs to be removed? I usually always remove the dried up caterpillars before putting them in water and anything that'll fall off into the water. That way I can keep it clean as much as possible. And also when you're changing out your reservoir, make sure to sanitize it like we talked about earlier. So again, you use that cleaning solution and clean out your reservoir. That way it's perfectly sterile and sanitized for your monsteras. And this would also be the time where you give them a fresh water solution. So if you look at my monsteras in the video clip here, you'll actually notice that they're about ready to be potted up. Their roots look really fantastic. They've actually been rooting for 2 weeks as of today, so they're right on point. I'm actually going to be evaluating them tomorrow morning when I change out the reservoir to deem who is actually ready. What is interesting that I actually have noticed is that the ones with the grow light above them have actually rooted a lot faster than the ones that are just relying on the natural light coming in through the windows. So this was something I found interesting. I wanted to do this on purpose just to see if it actually made a difference, and I'm actually surprised that it really did. Monsteras are usually such vigorous rooters that I didn't really think it would make that big of a difference. But honestly, just seeing the roots and having them in the exact same conditions, minus the one grow light, actually made the world of difference. They're certainly rooting on top, but they're not rooting to the degree they are on the bottom shelf. So I found that to be a really interesting fact. So I do recommend you using some kind of grow light or keeping them in an area that is really well lit while you're rooting them so that your plants root even quicker. So if you follow these methods, you probably are wondering how long will it take you to root these plants? Well, like I had mentioned in the video clip that I just showed you, 2 weeks is really about probably your minimum base. I would say after 1 week, your roots look really great, but honestly, they're not ready for being pot up yet. I usually like them to be about 4 to 6 inches long before I go ahead and pot them up in my substrate. So a lot of the times you're looking at 2 to 4 weeks. Now, if you follow all these steps and have them in optimal conditions, they should be ready in 2 weeks. 4 weeks should really be your latter end. You don't need to wait for them to develop an entire root system before you go ahead and pot them. I see a lot of people do that, and I'm not sure why, but they're perfectly fine with just 4 to 6 inches of roots, and then you can go ahead and pot them. I've never had an issue with that. I've seen some people also plant them and not water them right away. Don't do that. I feel like people think it's this transition of water roots to soil roots that they should wait, but that's a big mistake. If you actually don't water your monstera right after repotting them, you're risking your root drying up, and then when you do rewater it, it's going to have issues because it's already dried up, so you have the potential for things like rot or it taking up too much water into its leaves and causing damage, so you really don't want to do anything like that. So pot them up, water them right away. So I hope you found these tips helpful. Please let me know if you have any questions down below, and thank you so much for watching.